The Battle of Kadesh. The oldest war story ever recorded, and what it really reveals. For more than 3,000 years, Ramses II has been winning the same battle. On the walls of Egyptian temples, the pharaoh charges through his enemies with terrifying confidence. His bow is drawn. Hittite warriors collapse before him. Egyptian art presents the message with absolute certainty. At Kadesh, Ramses faced overwhelming forces and emerged victorious. But there is a problem. After the battle, Kadesh was not conquered by Egypt. Hittite influence remained strong in the region, and the enemy Ramses supposedly crushed was still powerful enough to challenge Egyptian ambitions. So what actually happened? Around 1274 BCE, Ramses II marched north into Syria, where Egypt and the Hittite Empire were competing for influence over strategically important kingdoms and trade routes. At the center of this struggle stood Kadesh, a fortified city near the Orontes River. For Ramses, taking it would demonstrate that Egyptian power had returned to the north. For the Hittite king Muwatalli II, losing it could weaken an entire network of alliances. Thousands of Egyptian soldiers advanced toward the city. Ramses believed the main Hittite army was still far away after receiving information from two men encountered during the campaign. The information was false. Muwatalli had concealed his forces near Kadesh. By the time captured Hittite scouts revealed the truth, Ramses had already moved into a dangerous position. His army was divided into separate corps, and not all of them were close enough to support him immediately. Then the Hittites attacked. Chariots struck an Egyptian formation still approaching the royal position. Soldiers broke. Survivors rushed toward Ramses' camp, carrying panic with them as Hittite chariots followed. Within a short period, a campaign intended to display Egyptian supremacy had become a struggle to prevent disaster. This is where Ramses' official story becomes extraordinary. According to Egyptian accounts, his troops abandoned him. Surrounded by enemies, the pharaoh called upon Amun and personally launched devastating attacks against the Hittites, transforming catastrophe into triumph. Ramses almost certainly participated in the fighting, and the Egyptian army did recover. But the monuments created something much larger than a battlefield recovery. They created a legend. Across Egypt, Ramses commissioned inscriptions and reliefs showing himself towering above his enemies. A complicated confrontation became a simple story. The army failed, the king stood firm, divine favor protected him, and Egypt prevailed. Yet the strategic aftermath refuses to fit that perfect ending. The Hittites were not destroyed. Their regional power survived, and Kadesh did not become the permanent Egyptian possession we might expect after the overwhelming victory depicted on temple walls. This does not prove that Ramses simply lost. The reality is more interesting. The Hittites failed to destroy the Egyptian army despite achieving surprise. Ramses survived a dangerous tactical crisis and restored enough order to continue resisting. But Egypt also failed to achieve the decisive strategic result its monumental propaganda suggests. Kadesh therefore leaves us with two battlefields. One existed beside the Orontes, where soldiers fought amid dust, horses, chariots, confusion, and incomplete information. The other was created afterward, in stone. On that battlefield, Ramses controlled everything. He could decide which moment mattered. He could enlarge his courage, diminish everyone else's contribution, and transform uncertainty into victory. But his monuments preserved an unintended clue. To make Ramses appear heroic, they had to admit how close everything came to collapse. And that raises an even more disturbing question. How did one of the ancient world's most powerful armies enter such a vulnerable position in the first place? The answer begins before the first arrow was fired, in an invisible war of spies, alliances, deception, and kings who could change sides without warning. Before the first arrow, the invisible war for loyalty. Before Ramses II and Muwatalli II fought with chariots, they fought with something less visible: loyalty. Syria was filled with smaller kingdoms caught between two superpowers. Their rulers faced a dangerous calculation. Supporting Egypt could bring protection, trade, and prestige. But if the Hittites remained stronger in the region, loyalty to Ramses could cost them their thrones. The same danger existed in reverse. This meant the frontier between Egypt and the Hittite Empire was not simply a line on a map. It was a network of cities whose allegiance could shift according to military pressure, diplomacy, fear, and opportunity. One kingdom could change sides and alter the balance around its neighbors. That made information extremely valuable. Messengers moved between courts. Scouts watched roads. Local rulers negotiated with stronger kings. Intelligence about troop movements, alliances, and possible defections could influence an entire campaign before armies met. Ramses was therefore marching into a political landscape where appearances could be deadly. Egypt had dominated significant territories in the Levant during earlier periods of the New Kingdom, but Hittite expansion had challenged that influence. By Ramses' reign, Hatti controlled an impressive network in Syria. Muwatalli was defending that system. He was also capable of mobilizing forces connected to numerous territories under Hittite influence. Kadesh was therefore not going to be a simple confrontation between two isolated national armies. Ramses was entering a coalition war. Every ruler watching the campaign understood what was at stake. If Egypt captured Kadesh and pushed Hittite influence northward, cities might reconsider their loyalties. If Ramses failed, Hittite authority would appear more secure. Reputation itself had strategic value. Then Muwatalli gained an advantage that no weapon could provide. Ramses received false information. According to the Egyptian narrative, two men encountered by Egyptian forces claimed that the Hittite king had withdrawn far from Kadesh. The report made the situation appear favorable. It was exactly what Ramses wanted to believe. And it was wrong. The Hittite army was concealed nearby. The deception becomes even more significant when we consider how ancient commanders received information. Ramses had no aerial reconnaissance, instant communication, or real-time map showing enemy movements. His understanding of the battlefield depended upon scouts, prisoners, messengers, local knowledge, and reports whose reliability could be difficult to verify. A false report could reshape reality inside a commander's mind. That is precisely what happened. Ramses continued forward under the assumption that his principal enemy was distant. Only after other Hittite scouts were captured and interrogated did the Egyptians discover the danger. Muwatalli had not retreated. He was close enough to strike. Suddenly, everything Ramses had believed about his position changed. Kadesh was no longer merely the objective ahead. It was cover for an enemy army. The distance between Egyptian formations was no longer routine marching space, it was vulnerability, and every moment required to send new orders was time the Hittites could exploit. This is why Kadesh began before the famous chariot attack. The first decisive weapon was information. For a critical period, Muwatalli knew where Ramses was, while Ramses misunderstood where Muwatalli was. One king was making decisions based on reality. The other was making them based on deception. But false intelligence could only create the opportunity. The Hittites still had to exploit it before Ramses corrected his mistake. And when the pharaoh looked south toward the rest of his forces, the scale of the danger became clear. His army was not concentrated. 4 Egyptian corps were moving across the landscape at different distances. They belonged to Ramses. But when the Hittites attacked, belonging to the same army would mean very little if they could not reach one another in time. 4 armies walking into a trap. Ramses II commanded a powerful army, but at the moment he needed it most, much of that army was somewhere else. The Egyptian force approaching Kadesh was divided into 4 major corps named after the gods Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Seth. They were part of the same campaign, but they were marching at different distances along the route. Ramses advanced near the front with Amun. Ra followed behind. Ptah was farther south. Seth was more distant still. Under normal marching conditions, this separation was manageable. Thousands of soldiers, horses, chariots, supplies, and support personnel could not move efficiently as one compact mass. But Ramses was no longer operating under normal conditions. A concealed enemy was waiting nearby. Once captured scouts revealed Muwatalli's true position, the pharaoh faced a brutal problem. He could send orders to the formations behind him, but communication moved only as fast as a messenger could travel. There was no way to instantly concentrate thousands of men. The Hittites understood the opportunity. They did not need to defeat all 4 Egyptian corps simultaneously. They needed to strike one before the others could intervene. The Ra corps was still approaching when Hittite chariots attacked. For the Egyptians, the timing was devastating. These soldiers had not calmly deployed into a prepared battle formation. They were caught during movement as fast Hittite vehicles crashed into their position. The formation broke. Men fled north toward Ramses's camp, but they were not arriving alone. The Hittite attack followed them. Now panic became a weapon. Imagine standing inside the Egyptian camp without knowing exactly what had happened farther south. Suddenly, your own soldiers appear running toward you. Behind them comes the enemy. The sight alone can destroy confidence. Within moments, disorder from one Egyptian formation was spreading into another. The royal camp contained tents, supplies, wagons, animals, servants, weapons, and soldiers trying to understand what was happening. What had been an organized military position became a maze of obstacles and frightened men. Ramses was now dangerously exposed. On paper, he still commanded 4 corps. On the battlefield, only the troops capable of reaching him mattered. This is one of Kadesh's most important military lessons. An army's strength is not simply the number of soldiers it possesses. It is the number a commander can bring to the decisive point at the decisive moment. Muwatalli had created local superiority. His deception had encouraged Ramses forward. Egyptian separation had magnified the mistake. The attack against Ra turned distance into crisis. Yet the Hittites faced their own deadline. Surprise does not last forever. Every minute gave Egyptian commanders another chance to regroup. Every approaching reinforcement threatened to reduce the advantage Muwatalli had created. The Hittites, therefore, needed to transform panic into complete collapse. They drove deeper toward the Egyptian position, and for a moment, it appeared possible. But the same chariots that had shattered the marching Egyptians were now entering a very different battlefield. Open space was disappearing. Vehicles, tents, fleeing soldiers, defenders, frightened horses, and scattered equipment filled the area. Speed had created the Hittite breakthrough. Now speed was carrying them directly into congestion. The trap had worked almost perfectly. The Egyptians were divided. Ra had been struck. Ramses's position had been penetrated. But Muwatalli had not yet destroyed the army. And inside the crowded Egyptian camp, the Hittites were about to discover that breaking into an enemy position could be easier than controlling what happened once they were inside. The chariot's deadliest moment, when speed became chaos. The Hittite chariots had achieved exactly what Muwatalli needed. They had surprised the Egyptians, broken the Ra corps, and penetrated toward Ramses II's camp before the rest of his army could fully respond. But the weapon that created the breakthrough was now entering an environment where its greatest advantage could disappear. A chariot needed movement. Horses, driver, warrior, wheels, weapons, and terrain had to work together. Across relatively open ground, a trained crew could attack quickly, change position, and exploit gaps in an enemy formation. Inside a crowded military camp, everything changed. Tents blocked routes, wagons restricted movement, equipment covered the ground. Egyptian soldiers were running between vehicles while others attempted to regroup. Frightened horses added another layer of unpredictability. The battlefield became congested. A chariot forced to slow down became easier to attack. A damaged wheel could immobilize its crew. A wounded horse could send a vehicle off course. One overturned chariot could obstruct those coming behind it. The Hittites had carried chaos into the Egyptian position. Now they were moving through the chaos they had created. This gave Ramses something he desperately needed: time. Egyptian resistance began to recover. Chariot crews counterattacked. Soldiers who had fled could regroup when they saw that the Hittites were not unstoppable. Additional forces approaching the battlefield increased the pressure on attackers whose initial momentum was fading. Egyptian accounts transformed this recovery into the defining moment of Ramses' legend. The pharaoh is portrayed standing almost alone, calling upon Amun before driving repeatedly against the enemy. Temple reliefs show his chariot moving with perfect control, while Hittite warriors collapse around him. Ramses may genuinely have fought with courage during the crisis, but no king could reverse a battle involving thousands of men by himself. Egyptian survival required soldiers to stop fleeing, officers to restore command, chariot crews to fight back, and reinforcements to enter the struggle. The battle was turning because several things were happening simultaneously, and the Hittites had another problem. A force pursuing a collapsing enemy can begin to believe victory has already been achieved. Formation can loosen. Individual warriors may become distracted. Command becomes harder as units spread through an enemy position. The difference between pursuit and disorder can become dangerously small. Now the psychological pressure began moving in the opposite direction. Egyptian soldiers saw resistance forming. Hittite crews encountered defenders where they had expected fugitives. The royal camp had not fallen. Ramses was still alive. The Egyptian army had bent violently, but it had not broken completely. Fighting pushed toward the area of the Orontes, and Egyptian representations show Hittite forces thrown into dramatic confusion near the river. The artistic scenes exaggerate the clarity of what must have been an extraordinarily messy confrontation. But they preserve the central reversal Ramses wanted remembered. The ambush had failed to become annihilation. Muwatalli had gained the advantage of surprise and brought the Egyptian command position close to disaster, yet his forces had not delivered the decisive blow. Ramses had survived. But surviving was not the same as conquering Kadesh, and behind the gigantic image of the pharaoh stood another uncomfortable reality. Someone had actually stopped those chariots. Someone had carried orders through the confusion. Someone had rallied the frightened troops. Someone had fought beside Ramses when the royal position was threatened. Thousands of people made the Egyptian recovery possible. Most would disappear from the story. Because when Ramses transformed Kadesh into legend, there was room for only one hero. The men erased from Ramses' greatest moment. When Ramses II turned Kadesh into a monument, thousands of men became background. The pharaoh dominates the surviving imagery because that was the political purpose of the story. Yet an army could not march hundreds of kilometers, maintain horses, carry supplies, transmit orders, survive an ambush, and reorganize under attack through the actions of one man. Behind Ramses stood an entire human machine. Egyptian infantrymen had endured the long march north carrying weapons and equipment through heat and dust. Chariot crews depended on horses that required food, water, constant handling, and specialized care. Craftsmen maintained vehicles, servants moved supplies, officers attempted to preserve discipline across formations stretched along the road. Then there were the messengers. Once Ramses discovered that Muwatalli was nearby, orders had to reach Egyptian corps still approaching Kadesh. Every instruction traveled physically across the landscape. A messenger carrying an urgent command was carrying time itself. If he arrived too late, hundreds or thousands of soldiers might remain unaware that the entire tactical situation had changed. During the Hittite attack, another group became equally important: standard bearers. In the dust and noise of combat, soldiers could lose sight of commanders and companions. Military standards provided visible points around which scattered men could reorganize. When formations began collapsing, a recognizable standard could mean the difference between continuing to run and discovering that part of the army was still resisting. Then came the Egyptian chariot crews. They fought in an environment far removed from the clean battle scenes carved afterward. Horses collided with obstacles. Vehicles maneuvered around fugitives and attackers. Visibility deteriorated. Decisions had to be made within seconds. These men helped turn Hittite penetration into a contested fight, and reinforcements also mattered. Egyptian representations indicate the arrival of forces commonly associated with the Naaran during the crisis. Their precise identity remains debated, but their appearance complicates the heroic version of Ramses standing virtually alone against an entire enemy army. The Egyptian recovery was collective. Ramses could still have demonstrated genuine courage. He could have personally led counterattacks and helped restore confidence. But courage from the king only mattered because other men responded. A soldier stopped running. An officer gathered survivors. A driver controlled terrified horses. A messenger reached another formation. A reinforcement entered the battle. A wounded man remained behind, while his companions continued fighting. History compresses these individual moments into phrases such as, "The Egyptians recovered." For the people inside the battle, recovery was not a phrase. It was survival. The Hittite soldiers experienced the same brutal reality. Their crews had entered the fight with an extraordinary tactical advantage. Some would have believed the Egyptian army was collapsing before them. Then resistance hardened, counterattacks developed, and the battle they expected to win quickly became far more dangerous. Most of their names vanished, too. This is one of the great inequalities of ancient history. Kings leave monuments. Ordinary soldiers leave bodies. Ramses possessed the resources to decide how Kadesh would be remembered. The men who fought beside him did not. So the proportions changed. The pharaoh became enormous. Everyone else became small. But the royal narrative created an unintended problem. To make Ramses appear extraordinary, his monuments needed the Egyptian army to appear dangerously close to failure. His soldiers had to flee so he could stand firm. He had to become isolated so his resistance could seem miraculous. The enemy had to become terrifying so his survival could become magnificent. And by emphasizing those details, Ramses preserved evidence of the very disaster his victory story was designed to overcome. The forgotten soldiers, therefore, lead us directly to the most revealing evidence of Kadesh, the monuments themselves. Because the closer we examine Ramses' celebration of victory, the more it begins to look like an accidental confession. What the monuments accidentally confessed. Ramses II wanted Kadesh remembered as a triumph. But to make his triumph extraordinary, he had to preserve the moment when everything nearly collapsed. That is the contradiction hidden inside his own monuments. The Egyptian accounts do not describe a flawless campaign. They acknowledge deception, surprise, separated forces, fleeing soldiers, and a pharaoh suddenly exposed to extreme danger. These details were useful because they made Ramses' recovery appear almost superhuman. The greater the disaster, the greater the hero. Across major Egyptian temples, inscriptions and reliefs transformed Kadesh into a carefully structured drama. Ramses advances, discovers the enemy's deception, finds himself surrounded, calls upon Amun, and fights back while others fail around him. This was not neutral military reporting. It was royal storytelling. The visual language makes the message even stronger. Ramses towers above everyone else. His chariot remains controlled while enemies collapse around him. The battlefield appears organized around one dominant figure. Real combat could never have looked so clean. Thousands of soldiers would have experienced different fragments of the confrontation. Dust, restricted visibility. Orders arrived late. Units lost contact. Commanders could understand what was happening nearby while remaining unaware of events elsewhere. The monuments remove that uncertainty. They give Kadesh one perspective: Ramses. Yet underneath the propaganda are facts difficult to ignore. Why did Egyptian troops flee if the campaign had unfolded according to plan? Why did attackers penetrate so deeply toward the royal position? Why did Ramses need to portray himself rescuing the army from catastrophe? The simplest explanation is also the most revealing. The crisis was real. What changed afterward was its meaning. Ramses turned vulnerability into courage. Surprise became the setting for divine intervention. Military recovery became personal triumph. Even the failure of Egyptian troops served the king. The weaker they appeared, the more exceptional Ramses became. This does not mean his courage was invented. It means genuine events were arranged to communicate a political message. That distinction is crucial. Propaganda is often most effective when it does not fabricate everything. It selects real events, magnifies certain details, minimizes others, and tells the audience how those facts should be interpreted. Kadesh offered Ramses perfect material. He had survived. The army had avoided destruction. The Hittite assault had failed to deliver a decisive annihilation. Those realities could be transformed into something far greater than an uncertain battlefield result. Victory. But Ramses could control stone more easily than he could control consequences. Once the soldiers left Kadesh, the political map became another kind of evidence. If Egypt had truly achieved the overwhelming triumph depicted on temple walls, we should expect the strategic aftermath to reflect it. Hittite influence should have collapsed, Egyptian authority should have expanded decisively, and Kadesh itself should have become Ramses' prize. Instead, the city remained outside lasting Egyptian control. The Hittite position in Syria survived. The rivalry continued. This is where the monument loses its ability to dictate the verdict. Stone could tell Egyptians that Ramses had won. It could not force the geopolitical world to behave as though Muwatalli had been decisively defeated. And that leaves us with the strongest test of Ramses' famous victory. Stop looking at what the pharaoh said happened. Look at what happened next. Because the years after Kadesh would deliver a verdict no royal artist could completely rewrite. Kadesh after Kadesh, when the real verdict emerged. The battlefield could be carved into a victory. The political map could not. After the fighting ended, Ramses II returned south without securing lasting control of Kadesh. The Hittite Empire remained powerful in Syria, and the strategic system Muwatalli II had defended did not collapse. This does not mean Ramses had simply been defeated. Egypt had survived a dangerous tactical crisis. The Hittites had failed to destroy the Egyptian army or capture its king, but Ramses had marched north to achieve something greater than survival. He wanted to change the balance of power. Kadesh shows little evidence that he accomplished that decisively. For the smaller kingdoms watching from across Syria, this mattered enormously. Their rulers did not need to decide whose monuments were more impressive. They needed to know which empire could protect them, punish rebellion, and maintain influence after its armies departed. The answer remained complicated. Egypt could still project military force northward. Ramses would campaign again in the region during later years. Yet the need for further operations itself reveals that Kadesh had not settled the struggle. This exposes the difference between battlefield recovery and strategic victory. Ramses recovered. Muwatalli preserved much of the regional order he had entered the battle to defend. Neither side eliminated the other. That is why asking who won Kadesh produces different answers depending on what victory means. If victory meant surviving the Hittite ambush, Ramses had reason to celebrate. If it meant destroying the Egyptian army, Muwatalli failed. If it meant permanently capturing Kadesh, Egypt failed. If it meant preserving Hittite influence around the contested region, the Hittites achieved something strategically important. The battle produced no clean solution, and eventually both empires had to confront a larger reality. War was expensive, while the political world around them continued changing. After Muwatalli's death, the Hittite monarchy entered a period of dynastic tension. Hattusili III eventually took the throne after removing his nephew Mursili III. At the same time, other powers, particularly Assyria, were becoming increasingly important in the Near Eastern balance. Permanent hostility between Egypt and Hatti became less useful, so former enemies began moving towards something their chariots had failed to create: Stability. Years after Kadesh, Ramses II and Hattusili III formalized a peace agreement. Surviving Egyptian and Hittite versions make it one of the earliest international peace treaties preserved in substantial detail. It was not an idealistic rejection of warfare. It was strategy by different means. The agreement established peaceful relations and included commitments involving mutual support. Later, diplomacy between the royal houses deepened further, and Ramses married a Hittite princess. The transformation is striking. The people depicted as terrifying enemies in Ramses's battle imagery became diplomatic partners. That shift reveals the ultimate limitation of Kadesh. Neither superpower had been able to force the other permanently out of the contest. Diplomacy achieved what one spectacular confrontation could not: a workable relationship between rivals strong enough to survive each other. But even this new order would not last forever. Within generations, the late Bronze Age world entered a period of profound disruption. The Hittite Empire eventually disappeared as a great imperial power. Egypt survived, but its ability to dominate territories far beyond the Nile would diminish. The geopolitical world that made Kadesh so important was fading. Cities changed, empires contracted or vanished. The soldiers who fought beside the Orontes disappeared from living memory. Yet Ramses' version survived. The territorial consequences of Kadesh were temporary. Its story lasted more than 3,000 years, and that leads to the final mystery. Perhaps Ramses's greatest victory was never over the Hittites. Perhaps it was over memory itself. Because long after both empires lost the world they had fought to control, one king's version of a single day remained carved into history. The first war story and the question. History never escaped. More than 3,000 years later, the armies of Kadesh are gone. The soldiers disappeared. The chariots decayed. The Hittite Empire eventually collapsed. Egypt survived, but the political world Ramses II fought to dominate changed beyond recognition. Yet on ancient temple walls, Ramses is still charging. His bow remains drawn. His enemies are still falling. The pharaoh still appears victorious. The battle ended. The story survived. And that is what makes Kadesh far more important than a dispute over who controlled a battlefield in 1274 BCE. Every battle exists twice. First, there is the event experienced by those who were there. That version is fragmented. One soldier sees his formation collapse. Another arrives after the attack begins. A chariot driver sees only the enemies directly ahead. A messenger carries an order without knowing whether the situation will change before he delivers it. Even a king sees only part of the battlefield. Then comes the second version, the story created afterward. This version can remove confusion. It can choose a hero, identify a villain, define a turning point, and declare a winner. Ramses possessed something ordinary soldiers did not: the power to make his version permanent. His monuments transformed collective survival into royal greatness. This does not mean everything Ramses claimed was false. Egypt genuinely recovered from a severe crisis. The Hittites failed to destroy his army. Ramses may have personally demonstrated considerable courage. But the proportions changed. Thousands of actions became one man's achievement. An uncertain strategic outcome became a triumph. The inability to permanently capture Kadesh disappeared behind images of enemies collapsing beneath the pharaoh. That is why the most important question is no longer simply, who won? It is, who controlled the memory of what happened? If victory means destroying Egypt, Muwatalli failed. If it means permanently taking Kadesh, Ramses failed. If it means surviving an ambush, Egypt recovered. If it means preserving Hittite influence in the region, Hatti had a strong claim to strategic success. But if victory means convincing people thousands of years later to see you as the hero, Ramses achieved something extraordinary. His battlefield victory remains debatable. His victory over memory lasted for millennia. There is an irony he could never have anticipated. The monuments designed to prove his greatness survived long enough for historians to question them. Their descriptions of deception reveal Egyptian vulnerability. Their emphasis on fleeing soldiers exposes the severity of the crisis. Their need for a miraculous royal recovery suggests how close the campaign came to catastrophe. The propaganda survived. So did the clues hidden inside it. And this is why Kadesh still matters. The technologies of information have changed, but the struggle over historical memory has not. Rulers still want victories remembered and failures explained. States still construct narratives around wars. Images still simplify events too complicated to fit inside a single frame. Kadesh shows that this struggle is ancient. Long before newspapers, cameras, television, or the internet, Ramses understood something fundamental about power. Controlling an event is difficult. Controlling how people remember it can sometimes be easier. Picture Kadesh one last time. Not the monument, the battlefield. Broken chariots lie across the ground. Exhausted survivors search for companions. Horses stand wounded beside abandoned equipment. Men who fought for Egypt and Hittite have no idea historians will still argue about their battle 3,000 years later. For them, there is no legend yet, only the aftermath. Then the soldiers leave, and the storytellers begin. That was when the Second Battle of Kadesh started. Ramses could not permanently conquer the city. He could not destroy the Hittite Empire. He could not force the battlefield to deliver the perfect victory his monuments would later display. But he could carve his version into stone. And perhaps that is what the oldest surviving great war stories ultimately reveals. Wars determine who controls the battlefield for a moment.